Most people think the Golden Age of Piracy happened somewhere warm. Nassau, Tortuga, the Indian Ocean. The question this video answers is why so much of it ran through frozen harbours and cod-fishing settlements and river towns of what is now Canada, and why almost nobody knows that. The single most important pirate resupply port on the North American Atlantic seaboard in the 1690s was not in the Caribbean. It was a spruce-covered anchorage on the coast of what is now Nova Scotia. Canso. Most people have never heard of it. Today, it's a small fishing town on the northeastern tip of Nova Scotia. In the 1690s, it was a lawless anchorage where the jurisdictional lines between French Acadia and English were genuinely unclear. And men who needed those lines to stay unclear found it extremely useful. The fishing grounds off Canso were rich enough that English, French, and New England vessels worked the same water, often without any governor's leave. That ambiguity made Canso a natural haven. Vessels operating outside the law could sail in, sell plundered cargo to New England merchants who asked no questions, take on salt, fish, rope, and fresh water, and leave before any authority knew they had arrived. Governor Joseph Dudley of Massachusetts wrote to the Board of Trade in London in 1707, specifically naming Canso as a point where contraband from piratical vessels was being offloaded and absorbed into legitimate Atlantic trade. He couldn't stop it because the settlement had no garrison, no customs officers, and no consistent legal jurisdiction. It fell between the French colonial administration, centered at Port Royal, and the English Crown's Reach, based in Boston. A gap pirates knew how to read. What made Canso different from Caribbean pirate haunts was the trade it connected. This wasn't about Spanish silver, it was about the cod fish economy. The same dried salt food that fed enslaved populations in the Caribbean and funded merchant houses in Bristol and Bordeaux. Pirates weren't just raiding the Atlantic. They were inserting themselves into the most important commercial networks of the early 18th century. But Canso was just the geography. The men who used it had names, and one of them would become the most wanted pirate in the North Atlantic. Before Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts, a pirate admiral named Peter Easton built a fortified base in Newfoundland and controlled enough firepower to hold off the English Royal Navy. Peter Easton. He arrived in Newfoundland around 1610, initially as a legitimate naval commander. The English crown had commissioned him to protect the fishing fleet from pirates. Within 2 years, Easton had become the problem he was sent to solve. Operating out of Harbour Grace and later Fairyland on Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula, Easton assembled a fleet of roughly 40 vessels and somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 men. Figures that dwarf the crews commanded by more famous pirates a century later. He raided the Spanish treasure fleet off the Azores. He seized vessels from Portugal, France, and England with equal appetite. His network extended from Newfoundland south along the New England coast, then across to West Africa and the Mediterranean. What made Easton formidable wasn't just his firepower. It was the colonial infrastructure he used. The Newfoundland fishing stations provided timber for repairs, salt for provisions, and a seasonal population of fishermen. Many of them desperate enough to sign on. In 1612, he reportedly pressed 500 Newfoundland fishermen into service in a single season. The governor of Newfoundland, Sir Richard Whitburn, met with Easton personally and tried to negotiate a pardon. Easton listened, then kept raiding. He eventually retired to Villefranche-sur-Mer in Savoy, purchased a title, and died wealthy. He was never caught. The Newfoundland base that made him possible was dismantled, but the pattern it established, using Canada's Atlantic coast as staging ground, not just a transit route, that persisted for over a century. Easton got out clean, but the next generation of pirates, using Canadian waters, wouldn't find retirement quite so straightforward. French colonial authorities in Quebec recorded over a dozen piratical incidents on the St. Lawrence River between 1680 and 1720, a river most people wouldn't associate with piracy at all. The St. Lawrence was the commercial artery of New France. Fur, timber, provisions, they all moved downriver toward the Atlantic. Trade goods and passengers moved up toward Montreal and Quebec City. The further a vessel got from Quebec City, the less oversight it faced. And the lower estuary, below the Ile d'Orléans, was where trouble tended to concentrate. In 1684, the intendant of New France, Jacques de Meaux, wrote the Minister of Marine in Versailles describing the problem plainly. Vessels trading without license were operating in the river's lower reaches, some of them armed, and the colonial government lacked the naval force to address it. The line between unlicensed trader, smuggler, and pirate was never clean in the 17th century Atlantic world, and the St. Lawrence was no exception. The river's geography made it worse. The lower estuary has tidal ranges that can exceed 4 meters and fog banks that can sit for days. A vessel that knew the shoals around Ile de Coudre of the channels near Tadoussac had a decisive advantage over any pursuer. Local knowledge was protection, and local knowledge was exactly what the Coureurs de Bois network provided. Men who moved between indigenous trade networks and French colonial commerce, who knew the river in every season, who weren't always particular about what cargo they were moving or whose flag they were flying. The St. Lawrence extended the piracy zone far inland, making the entire Gulf of St. Lawrence and the river above it part of the same predatory economy operating in the open Atlantic. That economy needed buyers onshore, and the merchants who provided them were operating in plain sight in Boston and Newport. The merchants who fenced pirate goods from Canadian waters weren't shadowy criminals. Some of them were the most respected men in Boston and Newport, holding public office while they did it. The economic relationship between piracy and respectable colonial commerce is one of the least flattering facts of early American history. Boston was the clearinghouse. Newport was not far behind. Merchants in both ports purchased plundered goods, furs, naval stores, dried fish, silver plate, from vessels that had taken them illegally, often in waters that included the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Nova Scotia coast. The mechanism was straightforward. A pirate vessel would anchor off a recognized rendezvous point, sometimes Canso, sometimes one of the small harbors along what is now the main New Brunswick coast. A merchant's factor, or the merchant himself, would come out in a lighter, inspect the goods, and agree a price. The cargo would then enter the legitimate trade as if it had originated from a lawful voyage. Customs records in Boston from the 1690s contain entries that don't add up. Cargo volumes that imply a source trade that documented voyage couldn't have produced. Samuel Burgess, a New York-based pirate who operated in the Indian Ocean in the 1690s and was arrested in 1700, partly because his connections to colonial merchants were too well documented for officials to ignore any longer. His case opened a small window onto the network. The goods he moved had touched Canadian ports. Acadian fish, and St. Lawrence furs, as part of a longer chain that ran from illicit Atlantic raiding back into legitimate colonial commerce. The colonial governors knew. Many of them took a share. Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York was formally accused by the Board of Trade of licensing privateers who were functionally pirates. And the Canadian coastal trade was part of what made the system work. If the merchants were the buyers, the privateers who turned pirate were the suppliers. And Canada produced several of the most effective ones. Between 1689 and 1713, Acadia changed hands between England and France 3 times. And every time sovereignty shifted, the privateers operating from its coast reset their commissions and kept raiding. Acadia, the colony covering what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and parts of Maine, was one of the most contested pieces of territory in the North Atlantic world. The wars between England and France that defined the late 17th century and early 18th century played out with particular ferocity here. And the legal instrument of war at sea was the letter of marque, a commission authorizing a private vessel to attack enemy shipping in exchange for a share of the prize. The problem was that Acadia's ownership was never stable long enough for those commissions to mean much. Port Royal fell to the English in 1654, was returned to France in 1667, and fell again in 1690 under Sir William Phipps. It was returned again under the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 and finally ceded permanently to Britain in 1713 under the Treaty of Utrecht. Each transfer left a class of armed men with vessels, weapons, and habits of maritime raiding, men whose legal status shifted from privateer to pirate depending on which treaty was currently in effect. Pierre Maisonnat, known as Baptiste, exemplifies this precisely. A French Acadian privateer, commissioned by the French crown, Maisonnat raided English New England, shipping throughout King William's War. When Acadia changed hands, his commission lapsed. He kept sailing. By the technical definition of the 1697 treaty, he had become a pirate. But he continued operating out of the same Acadian harbours, using the same networks and targeting the same type of vessel. Only the paperwork changed. Maisonnat was eventually captured. But the Acadian coast he operated from had by then generated something more organized, a pirate network with indigenous alliances. The Micmac Confederacy and French Acadian privateers ran coordinated maritime raids on English shipping in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It was an alliance that gave those raids an intelligence network no English governor could match. The Micmac had been trading with French colonists since the early 1600s. And their relationship with the French crown was formalized in a series of alliance agreements that made them active participants in the imperial conflicts between France and England. At sea, this translated into something specific and practical. Micmac scouts and intermediaries knew the coastlines of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Bay of Fundy, and the Acadian shores with a precision that no European chart could replicate. During Father Rail's War, the conflict running roughly from 1722 to 1725, Micmac warriors operating in concert with Acadian French attacked English fishing vessels off the Nova Scotia and Cape Breton coasts. These weren't random raids. They targeted vessels by type and location, which required advanced knowledge of fishing schedules and anchorage points. That knowledge came partly from the indigenous trade networks that had operated across the region for generations. Governor Samuel Shute of Massachusetts sent a report to London in 1722 describing the coordinated nature of these attacks, and specifically noting that the raiders appeared to know where English vessels would anchor before the vessels arrived. He attributed this to French Catholic missionaries, and the missionaries were certainly part of the network, but the logistical intelligence was Micmac in origin. This alliance complicated the English response significantly. You couldn't negotiate separately with the Acadian privateers and the Micmac because their operational relationship was too close. The raiding that looked like piracy from an English vessel on the receiving end was, from the other side, a coherent military and economic strategy with indigenous sovereignty at its core. The English Crown's answer to this problem was to build a counterforce, and the man they chose to lead it had a history in the Caribbean that hadn't been entirely clean. The man the English Crown appointed to suppress piracy in the waters off Nova Scotia in the 1720s had previously been investigated for piracy himself, and he wasn't the only one. The line between pirate hunter and pirate was genuinely thin in the colonial Atlantic, and the Crown knew it. Men with maritime raiding experience, a working knowledge of outlaw networks, and tolerance for ambiguous legal situations were precisely the type that colonial governors needed for anti-piracy operations in remote waters. The problem was finding someone reliable enough to use. Captain John Doucette, who commanded the English garrison at Annapolis Royal, the renamed Port Royal, in the early 1720s, provides one example of the tension. His official role was to hold Nova Scotia for the British Crown after Utrecht. His actual situation was managing a territory where the French Acadian population outnumbered English settlers by a significant margin. Micmac raids were a constant, and the coastline he was supposed to patrol was physically impossible to cover with his available force. In 1718, the Crown issued the Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy, which extended Admiralty Court jurisdiction to the colonies and allowed pirates to be tried without a jury in designated Vice Admiralty courts. This was intended to close the loophole that colonial juries, who often knew the defendants personally and benefited from their trade, had been using to acquit men who were plainly guilty. In Nova Scotia, enforcing the 1718 Act required cooperating with men whose own records didn't always bear scrutiny. Several of the vessels used for anti-piracy patrol in the Gulf of St. Lawrence during the early 1720s had themselves been involved in unlicensed raiding earlier in their careers. The Crown needed the capacity more than it needed clean hands. That capacity was about to be tested, because the largest pirate fleet active in North American waters in 1720 was operating directly off the Newfoundland and Nova Scotia banks. In June 1720, Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age of Piracy by prize count, sailed into Trepassey Harbour in Newfoundland and took 22 ships without firing a single shot. Roberts had taken command of his pirate fleet only weeks before, following the death of his captain Howell Davis off the West African coast. By the time he reached Trepassey, he was still establishing authority over a crew that hadn't chosen him. The Newfoundland raid changed that. Trepassey was a busy fishing harbor on the southern Avalon Peninsula. In June 1720, it held roughly 22 ships and over 150 fishing vessels smaller than a ship, shallops and sack vessels servicing the Grand Banks fleet. Roberts sailed in under a black flag, with drums beating and a trumpet sounding. No one resisted. The fishing captains weren't military men, their crews were not fighters, and there was no garrison. Roberts took his pick of the vessels, pressed men from the crews who had skills he needed, and destroyed the ships he didn't want. He stripped the harbor's provisions and naval stores, and then he left. He then sailed south and took the Portuguese treasure fleet off the Azores, which produced the wealth that funded the next phase of his career. But it was the Newfoundland harbor that gave him the vessel and the crew numbers to attempt the Azores operation. Canada was, in the sequence of Roberts' career, the logistical pivot. His articles, the written code of conduct his crew operated under, survive in Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account. They include provisions for prize shares, medical compensation for wounds, and rules on gambling aboard ship. Roberts's Newfoundland operation appears in that account as essentially unchallenged, which tells you exactly how exposed those harbours were. Roberts's raid exposed something the English crown had been avoiding admitting. The Canadian fishery was both an extraordinary asset and an indefensible one. The Newfoundland and Nova Scotia fisheries supplied pirate crews with something the Caribbean couldn't: experienced deep water sailors who already knew the North Atlantic and had reason to be angry. The Newfoundland fishery operated on a system that was, by modern standards, remarkably close to debt bondage. Fishing servants, the men who did the actual work of catching, splitting, and salting cod, were signed on in West Country English ports under contracts that gave the merchant outfitters control of their wages until the season's catch was settled. A bad season, or a dishonest account, could leave a man owing money at the end of a voyage rather than earning it. The records from the Western Charter, the set of regulations governing English fishing operations in Newfoundland from the late 16th century onward, contain repeated references to servants absconding. They disappear from their boats or running from the plantations during the fishing season. Some of these men made their way into the crews and vessels operating outside the law. Roberts pressed men at Trepassey in 1720, but many of the men he pressed reportedly didn't object for long. Edward Lowe, who became one of the most feared pirates in the Atlantic between 1721 and 24, he recruited specifically from the New England and Newfoundland fishing grounds. His first act of piracy occurred in Boston Harbour in 1721, after a dispute over wages with a merchant captain. The men who joined him knew the North Atlantic fishing routes, which is exactly what a pirate captain needed if he intended to operate in those waters. The economics of the Grand Banks fishery created a steady supply of men who were experienced, resentful, and already in the water. Piracy offered the same work, with better pay and no outfitter taking a cut. That recruitment pipeline alarmed the fishing merchants of Devon and Dorset as much as it alarmed the Crown, and their lobbying in Parliament produced one of the era's most revealing documents about Canadian waters and piracy. In 1721, West Country fishing merchants petitioned the British Parliament with specific losses: named vessels, named captains, named cargoes, taken by pirates operating off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and the total was enough to threaten the financial foundations of the Grand Banks trade. The petition that West Country merchants submitted to Parliament in 1721 is one of the most direct primary documents linking Canadian waters to the economic crisis created by the Golden Age piracy. The merchants weren't speaking in abstractions. They listed ships by name, they gave the dates and approximate locations of capture, and calculated losses in pounds sterling that they argued justified a permanent naval convoy system for the Newfoundland fishing fleet. The losses they documented weren't incidental. The Grand Banks cod trade was among the largest by volume in the Atlantic world in 1720. Dried salt cod fed plantation labor in the Caribbean and provided a crucial trade good in the network connecting Britain, her colonies, Southern Europe, and the Atlantic slave economy. Disrupting the fishery disrupted a chain that ran far beyond Newfoundland. Parliament's response was limited. The Royal Navy was already stretched between Atlantic patrol duties and the ongoing need to maintain presence in the Caribbean and along the West African coast, the two other poles of the piracy problem. What the 1721 petition produced in practical terms was an authorization for additional convoy escorts during the fishing season, but no permanent station vessel for the Canadian fishery until well after the Golden Age had effectively ended. The petition also named Bartholomew Roberts specifically as the primary threat. Roberts was dead, by February 1722, killed in a naval engagement off West Africa. But the vulnerabilities the petition described, ungarrisoned harbors, inadequate patrol capacity, a coastline too long and too complex for any available naval force to cover, those didn't close with Roberts' death. They persisted until the military buildup at Halifax in 1749, nearly 3 decades later. The piracy of the Golden Age wasn't solved in the Caribbean. In Canadian waters, it was simply outlasted. Which brings us to what all of this actually means. Not just for the history of piracy, but for the history of Canada itself. Here's what the through line adds up to. The Golden Age of Piracy was not a Caribbean phenomenon that occasionally visited northern waters. Canada's Atlantic coast, Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, was structural to how piracy operated in this era. It provided harbors, provisions, recruits, and an intelligence network rooted in Indigenous alliance. It generated privateers who became pirates when the treaties changed. It fed pirate fleets through the economics of a fishery designed to keep men poor, and it did all of this largely outside the reach of any colonial government powerful enough to stop it. The reason this doesn't appear in most piracy histories is partly about narrative gravity. Blackbeard and Nassau make better television, and partly because Canadian colonial history has been told through a different set of concerns. But the documents are there. Dudley's letters, Demille's dispatches, the 1721 petition, Johnson's account of Roberts. The evidence isn't hidden. It's just been read by different specialists who haven't been talking to each other. And if you want to understand the Golden Age of Piracy as an economic system, rather than a collection of colorful individuals, Canada is not a footnote. It is a load-bearing wall. If you found your way to the end of this one, you're exactly the kind of person I make these for. There's a lot more in the primary sources that didn't make it into this script. The full story of Pierre Maisonnet, the Western Charter documents, and what happened to Halifax's role in anti-piracy operations after 1749. I'll be covering those in a future video someday. Subscribe so you don't miss them. And if this is the kind of history you want to read as well as watch, I write long-form pieces over at chrissterling.com. The link is in the description.